Hello, my name is Alexis Eiland, and I will be presenting language and reading disabilities as it relates to speech production. So starting with defining language and reading disabilities. So both language and reading disabilities impact someone's ability to communicate, comprehend, and to learn. Language and reading disabilities do have some overlapping areas, but there are significant similarities and differences. Throughout this presentation, we will look at the comparing and the contrasting of language versus reading disabilities as well as some of their similarities. So some common areas of difficulty with language and reading disabilities are comprehension, memory, and attention. And someone with these disabilities may have a negative impact on their writing skills as it relates to organization, using correct grammar, spelling, and fluency. Now, taking a look at comparing and contrasting language versus reading disabilities, as well as some of their similarities. Let's start with language disabilities. So, in the brain, the Wernicke's area of the brain controls language comprehension. So, if there's any damage or trauma to that area of the brain, someone can have a language disability as a result of that. So, that person with a language disability may have issues with syntax and grammar, and that is basically just difficulty with word order and grammatical rules. So they may say something like, watch football halftime show instead of I watch the halftime football show. Another area of somebody with language disabilities is expressive language, and that is difficulty expressing their thoughts and finding the right words to convey what they are talking about or emotions. Another difficulty in language disabilities is receptive language, which is the difficulty to understand directions, stories, and questions. And further in the presentation, we'll talk about some of those difficulties with multi-step directions. And also social communication is another area that is impacted in the language disability. And that is basically just difficulty taking turns in conversations and understanding figurative language. Now let's move on to reading disabilities. So a reading disability. Someone with a reading disability may have difficulty decoding words, sounding out, and blending letters to sound. Also, they may be not reading at their age level or they're a slow reader. Another area is reading comprehension, which is difficulty understanding and decoding words, and poor word recognition or difficulty with sight words, and also spelling. And that's for language and reading disabilities. They might have some words that are spelled incorrectly. An example for a reading disability is if I have the word book, bat, basement, anything with the, and you don't understand that is associated with B, you're going to have troubles when you're writing or when you're reading if you have a reading disability. So some similarities between language and reading disabilities. So similarities can be difficulty with reading and writing as a secondary issue, as I mentioned on the first slide. Oftentimes people with these disabilities have writing issues as well. Language disability also affects comprehension when reading. So if you don't even understand words and their meaning, and if it's written, you're reading it on a page, you're not going to understand what you're reading if your language is not intact. Also, this similarities between language and reading disabilities is phonemic awareness, which is recognition and manipulating individual sounds. And also it can be a genetic or family factor as well. So if a close family member, like a parent or a sibling, has a language or a reading disability, 9 times out of 10, the person also in that family is going to be experiencing the same issues. And also exposure to rich language environments. So researchers have said that people with lower socioeconomic status often have language and reading disabilities because they're not immersed in those rich language cultures, which can just be simply parents talking to their children. And often, also, lastly, under the similarities is developmental language delays. So a child that has a developmental language delay, like a stutter, they might experience language and reading disabilities. And of course, we know that writing is also falls into those categories. So now moving on to what is speech perception. So speech perception is when the brain processes and interprets sounds, phrases, words, and spoken language. And under that falls semantic interpretation, which is the study of word meanings. And this aids in understanding figurative language. And we know that if somebody has a language disability, they oftentimes will have trouble decoding that figurative language. Under speech perception is understanding sentence and syntax processing or word recognition and their grammatical structure. So again, we see some similarities with language disabilities there, and also understanding context by making sense of unclear speech, which we talked about also with language disabilities. Comparing speech input to the mental dictionary or the lexical access used to recognize words, even when they are spoken unclearly. So an example of this I can give you is if someone says a phrase and you don't have any language or reading disabilities and you only catch the end of the phrase, their speech input that you heard, you only catch the ending of it, your lexical access or your mental dictionary will allow you to comprehend and to make a judgment of whatever it is that you heard. And you can probably figure it out even if you didn't hear the complete sentence. So that refers to that bullet point. And then moving on to auditory processing, which is huge in speech perception. So auditory processing refers to the frequency and the intensity that the brain detects sounds through pitch and loudness. It's also important when differentiating sounds. And then under that as well, auditory processing is sound detection, which is the perception of sound waves by the ear. So sound is converted into electrical signals by the cochlea and sent to the auditory cortex inside the brain. So moving on to how speech perception goes into language and reading disabilities. So starting with language disabilities. Someone with a learning disability may have trouble correctly perceiving speech sounds if they are unable to pair words with their meanings, and also difficulties in grammar, vocabulary, and expression of an idea. So an example of this can be a child who struggles with understanding and using language. They often will have difficulty hearing or recognizing sounds and putting the words together, especially in large settings like a classroom or a school. In school, they answer questions in complete sentences. They struggle with correctly following directions and using past tense verbs. And later on in the presentation, we'll talk about some of the SLP strategies to help with those difficulties following directions. Moving on to reading disabilities. So someone with a reading disability, such as dyslexia, may have difficulty in the phonological process of comprehending sounds and written words. So difficulties in comprehending written words due to the inability to decode or translate written words into spoken language by using knowledge of letter sound relationships. So like I mentioned before with the example with the B, if you don't know what B stands for, or if you don't know the sound B is associated with book or basement or bats, you're going to have difficulties when it comes across a page that you're supposed to be reading. So an example of this is a child with dyslexia has strong oral skills, which means that they can talk a lot, they can talk all day, but they struggle with reading. The child has difficulties blending sounds to make sense of written text, so they have trouble comprehending what they're reading. So that also goes into trouble with spelling and retaining information after they have read it. So if you can read all day and then you don't comprehend anything, you still have a reading disability. So some diagnoses and interventions for language and reading disabilities, starting with language disabilities. So the diagnosis process is speech and language evaluations that target receptive and expressive language and comprehension. So an intervention of this would be speech therapy or communication training, listening to complex sounds and sentences following multi-step instructions. So if a child has a language disability and you want to include it on an IEP, you can say something like, first, stand up and push your chair in, grab the broom, sweep underneath your desk, place the broom back. So that would help that child with following multi-step instructions. And also storytelling, asking a child to describe pictures in a story. This is a tool that SLPs do to see where the child is at on their language development, and it can also display if a child is a little bit behind their age group. So moving on to reading disabilities. So a diagnosis can be standardized reading tests focused on phonics, fluency, and comprehension. And some of the interventions used after the scores from the test would be structured literacy programs, literacy interventions, or phonetic instructions. And these can all be through the public school system through pull-out programs or reading literacy programs. So some of specific examples of those programs can be combining visual aids to kinetic techniques to help make connections between letters and sounds, and also echo reading. The child reads along with a fluent reader and imitates the pace and intonation of the text, and then hopefully they can do that on their own. And then lastly, I have a quick video here to describe some of those therapies. And that is the end of my presentation. The reference page is at the end. It's not displaying. There it is. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. Bye.